Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University. So today I'm with Professor Ash Casey and Professor David Kirk, and we're here to talk about applying models-based practice in physical education. We discuss current practices in PE, learn about what models-based practices are, before discussing how they can be better embedded into physical education. Hi guys, thanks for joining me on the Experts in Sport podcast.
Hello Martin.
Hi, good to see you, Martin.
Today we're going to talk about models-based practice within physical education and how it can be implemented. Before we do, can you provide us with a brief introduction to yourselves, starting with you, David?
Certainly, Martin. I'm currently Professor of Education at the University of Strathclyde. I've been there since 2014. Prior to that, after completing my PhD at Loughborough University in the mid-1980s in physical education curriculum, I've worked at universities in Australia and in England. I've been a visiting professor in Belgium and in Ireland. And I'm founding editor of a scholarly journal in the field, Physical Education and Sport Pedagogy. Ash is one of the very valued associate editors on that journal. We've been going since 2004, so we are coming up for our 21st anniversary soon.
Thanks, David. Thank you very much. And what about yourself, Ash?
So I'm currently Professor of Physical Education and Pedagogy at Loughborough University. Prior to that, I worked with David at the University of Bedford, and prior to that, actually Bedfordshire, I should say. I thought you bet that right. And then prior to that, I was a PE teacher for 15 years. David was actually my PhD supervisor. So I first met David in 2002 when I came to Loughborough to pursue a part-time master's degree, which was a kind of a seminal change for me in terms of being quite a traditional teacher. And I remember, having one of the first modules where we were asked to look at my past, present and future. And my future, I decided at that point, was models-based. Well, models, it wasn't models-based practice, but that was fairly significant. And then when David moved from Loughborough to Leeds Metropolitan University, then I ended up doing my PhD with him there. Followed a path, but cut my own way, I'd like to think as well. So not just.
Yeah, I'm not taking all responsibility for you.
Nice. Well, interestingly, as a conversation we just had off air really was, I did my PGCE at Bedford as well. So we have a history in PE at Bedford, and we've all kind of crossed paths around Loughborough, and other paths as well. So we clearly have, lots of people who know something about PE, and I'm not putting myself in anywhere near the same space as you guys, but I might have some interesting questions from my history in PE as well. So to get us started, can we have a look at a brief background into PE and how it's traditionally or more generally been taught within England?
So I talk to some of our undergraduates here, and I've talked to other people about this kind of history of PE, and I tend to start with PE starting in the late 19th century, with drill sergeants coming into schools and, literally drilling kids. I suspect probably completely wrongly, but that's kind of where drill comes from in terms of the that notion within physical education. Then you see the first national curriculum in 1908, I believe. And then you have this idea of physical activity moving through different areas, and David's written about this. If you were to go into a PE class in the 1950s, you'd probably see gymnastics, and you have a construction there in terms of lots of people doing gymnastics, and debates at the time were about which form of gymnastics. And in the 1960s, you see a relaxing in the kind of austerity measures that came out of the Second World War. You see people having more free time, and what they want to do in their free time is they want to go and watch and play sport. And then we get this change in the curriculum where we see physical education becoming much more about team games, which is imported from the private school sector as well. And then you have this constraint in terms of PE, in terms of what can be achieved in a lesson. So every subject gets its timetabled allocation. PE gets a little bit. What can you teach in a 50-minute lesson that then becomes a 20-minute lesson once everybody's changed? Well, you want something that's quite definable. So instead of, you can run 100 meters in, I think even the slowest person walking backwards can do it in kind of less than 35 seconds or, even a minute. So you have to spread it over. So you start to talk about the sprint start, you start to talk about the pickup and the drive. Equally, you teach cricket, which can take up to 5 days and still have a draw. And yet you're trying to do that. So it becomes what is teachable within that moment. So we have this history of drill, that notion of gymnastics where it's one skill following another skill. And that's how you get that progression. And you still see this in large stadia. And then you move into sport and sport technique. So that's the history as I would see it, probably inspired by sort of David's work.
Well, I would add two things to that, Martin. One of them is, first of all, to recognise that from the late 19th century until the middle of the 20th century, physical education was led by women. It was women who were the specialist trained teachers. There were very, very few men indeed who had specialist qualifications. The first college for men was actually in Glasgow, Scottish School of Physical Education, 1932, quickly followed by Carnegie in Leeds and then Loughborough, all in the 1930s. But they were producing very, very small numbers of men. And Bedford College, of course, was producing teachers from about 1903 continuously all the way through until today, which is a remarkable achievement. So that's the first thing to say. And women were mainly involved with Dano-Swedish gymnastics, and then later they got influenced by Rudolf Laban, and so we had movement education, and we had basic movement and all sorts of variations. So that's the first thing to say. Men came in large numbers after the Second World War and completely changed the physical education curriculum to the form that Ash is talking about. And this is the second thing I'd like to say, is that we can talk about configurations of physical education. Okay, so Ash mentioned physical education as gymnastics, but the gymnastics from the late 1800s until the middle of the century, 20th century, was Dano-Swedish gymnastics. It wasn't the Olympic form that we would think of as gymnastics now. So that's the first thing. Physical education is gymnastics. Then we moved into a phase where I've called this physical education as sports techniques, and deliberately not physical education as sport, because we don't see very much sport played in physical education lessons. When can we have a game, sir, is the common cry from kids. So as Ash said, there's a lot of teaching of sports techniques, the sprint start, the basketball layup, and so on. This is to fit the curriculum time that we've got, the 30 or so variably motivated and talented kids that teachers are challenged to deal with. I personally think that physical education and sports techniques period, which started in the 50s and is still going at the moment, and some would argue still the dominant form of practice, is actually starting. It was a blip. And what we're moving into now, I think, is a form of physical education that I would call physical education as health promotion. Wherever you look, physical activity and physical fitness are two key concepts in curricula that are being developed all over the world. And what does that look like in practice? Well, it looks like MVPA, moderate to vigorous physical activity, in whatever form that takes. A lot of talk about health and well-being. The Scottish curriculum for excellence, that's what the field is called, health and well-being. Physical education sits in there. So those are the two things I would say about the historical development of the field.
I think we've also got this idea of the importance of physical education as examination technique and practice and exams. So we have this thing where GCSE or O level it was at the time. I think we came in the early 80s, David.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, and this became particularly prior to the current iteration of exams, where there was more practical element, which was taken out by Michael Gove because it didn't fit his model of private education. They needed to be doing more exams and less practical in a subject that is supposed to be physical. But physical education was often seen as the place where some of the lower achieving students in other subjects would go and get a qualification. And what we've seen in many schools is GCSE content being taught in core PE from as young as 11. So we're beginning to get a scaffolding into place where some of that key knowledge is being taught from year 7, year 8 and year 9, so that when those kids arrive in year 10 to start their GCSEs, or in some schools it had been earlier historically, more recently, then they already have that base knowledge. But what you've seen then is a the limited time that PE has is now being used for things that the majority of kids in those lessons don't necessarily need, because they're focused very particularly on the exams. And a lot of this has come because the pressure has come onto the PE department in terms of, well, these are the kids who we don't think are going to do as well. So your responsibility is to get these kids another GCSE or another qualification, so the school looks good on the the various league tables. And PE departments felt a lot of pressure in terms of to do that. So they found ways of trying to supplement the knowledge that the young people have. And that's still the case in many respects. Is they're making a decision that's where they're really held accountable. They're not really held accountable in other ways, but that's where the benchmarking's occurring, where I remember in staff meetings when I was a teacher with a head teacher going, well, maths you did really well, but geography you need to pull your socks up. Well, you don't really want that as a department anyway. So, that can be a challenge as well.
Well, it comes back a lot to here, what is the purpose of PE, which I think is a huge question. And often people talk about PE, physical activity and sport kind of interchangeably in my experience. And like you just said, what are you held accountable to? And it's often exam results. It's not some of the things that I personally would say PE is there for, to develop a lifelong love of PE and sport and physical activity and, different things for different people is some of the stuff that one of the reasons I moved away from it was because it was this very much, 6-week block of teaching. And it, as you said there, David, when can we play football? When can we play this? When can we do that? And doing the PGCE, it was very much, well, I'm getting marked on me being able to deliver, teaching you this skill, a basketball layup, as you mentioned. I remember a session on a basketball layup where I was thinking, this is boring, but I just have to teach this. And, that was probably the start of me thinking, this is not for me. My biggest piece was a year 9 girls class. It was in a school in Bedfordshire. And the ball would bounce. They'd just smack it over the fence. And it was like, okay, girls, why are you doing that? This is boring. When am I going to play tennis? It's rubbish. And it was like, oh, okay. And I just convinced them to help me and behave a little bit just to be nice to me. And they kind of did, and they did bits. But they're like, I'm never going to play tennis. What's the point in this? And I was with them. And that was the start of my issues with PE. But you mentioned a few bits there, Ash, especially around the exam piece. Like my daughter's just left primary school, and she was being taught some of them things where I was thinking, this is very much heading towards GCSE PE already. And I didn't know if I thought that's a good or bad thing, knowledge of the body and all that kind of thing. I probably thought it was a positive, which takes me on that wide road of what is PE about? What are we trying to achieve in PE? And I know, David, you've done a lot of work with primary schools. So do you want to just touch upon that piece? Massive question there. What is PE? What's the point? How are we delivering it in primary schools before we start moving on to the models-based stuff?
Well, just to say, first of all, Martin, we're quite a disputatious field in physical education. We've got a lot of people putting forward definitions of this is what physical education is. In fact, we encourage our students to have their own philosophy of physical education, which I think is massively wrong. We need a shared philosophy. We need to understand what the subject is. But I've always argued that it's a kind of social epistemological approach. Rather than try and think about what physical education is, we go to places where people claim to be practicing physical education, like a school, like a physical education department written above the door. And that's physical education. It's what people do in its name. So an empirical investigation would be the thing that we are doing, actually, we have been conducting. So it's just that point to make. I haven't done a lot of work with primary schools, but what I have argued is that we have a massively misplaced resource. All of our specialist teachers, for the most part in the UK, are in secondary schools. Too late. You need to have those specialists with the expertise they have working in primary schools with primary age children. Those are the developmental years. What do you get instead? Well, you either get a relatively untrained primary school teacher who probably has had negative experiences of physical education themselves. I'm sorry if I'm sounding stereotypical here. I've just done the physical education block for our Bachelor of Arts education, primary education students, 4th years. Do you know how much physical education they got in their whole 4 years?
I'm going to say a day.
4 hours. That's what I taught them in 4 different groups. 4 hours. Yeah. What can you do? So you're either taught by an untrained primary school teacher, or you're taught by some part-time sports coach who's been brought in, who's got weekend qualifications, level 2 rugby, whatever. And that's not good enough. That's not good enough for our kids. Now, what's also running alongside this, and I'm old enough to remember when this was not the case. It was not the case for me, for example, as a child growing up in a working class background. But we now got kids who are in club sport from as young as 3, 4, 5. Yeah. And my grandson he's only 5, he's turning 6, and he's been swimming for 2 years. He's been playing rugby for 2 years. You know, my own kids were very, very similar. So they arrive at secondary school, age 11, 12, already with massive differences in their experiences of physical activity, sport, games, and so on. And teachers are expected to do something useful with that. So my argument, and it's kind of like the elephant in the room with physical educators, if we got a bunch of us together, mostly secondary trained, mostly working in the secondary sector, and we said, folks, we need to shift to primary. You just don't have that conversation because too many people are threatened by that. And, as Ash has been talking about the exams, I mean, physical educators only got into that because it was a means of raising their status in the first place, Sure, the kinesiology, sport and exercise science field was developing and they were experiencing that stuff in their own training. But just the same, I have to say too, just to qualify this a wee bit, that this is a problem for a very limited number of countries in the world, which is a very interesting thing because it then creates disparities when you start to look internationally at what physical education might be and how it's practiced. So England, Scotland, yes, we've got state level exams. Ireland has 2. New Zealand has. Some of the states in Australia have. I don't think the Canadians have. The Swedes have got something a bit like it. There's a test in China, I've just discovered, supervising some Chinese physical education PhD students, where physical fitness is a big part of the leaving certificate test. But the rest of the world, the United States, for example, FitnessGram would be as close as you get to any kind of testing, any kind of assessment. So, back to the point you asked about, my feeling is that we need specialists in primary schools. And there have been various attempts at this over the years, way back into the 70s. And for all sorts of institutional reasons, it hasn't happened. But yeah.
Well, we could go down that rabbit hole and we could talk about the primary sport premium and the outsourcing of PE and the private coaching enterprises, which, we'll say not all of which are bad in my opinion, but in my opinion, many of them are. But I think that's probably a whole other podcast we can talk about there. So if we just reframe that, traditionally, there's a big piece missing in primary school. They're getting to secondary school especially nowadays, with a huge chasm, a huge difference in their experiences and their abilities, which makes it really, really difficult for PE teachers to deliver what they want to deliver. But traditionally, what has been delivered is often not necessarily sport, but it's skill-based development of techniques within a sport over 4 to 6 weeks, often in, badminton, and then it's football, and then it's rugby, and that kind of thing. That's what we're talking about is traditionally been delivered.
Yeah, and as Darrell Siedentop, the famous American researcher, would put it, the same introductory lesson gets taught again and again and again across all of the years of secondary school.
That's again a big thing.
Yeah, I mean, I often have that discussion with the PGC students at Loughborough and the undergraduates when I'm talking, and I remember doing that. So I remember being a teacher, and we, year 8 would rock up, and what we're doing today, sir? Well, we're doing javelin, so we'd walk down or jog down to the javelin hut, where we had an old glider shed where we used to keep all the athletic stuff. And then we'd have a lecture in the door about how you have to hold the javelin out to the side, and you can't use it as a walking stick. And then you come out and you have to put it in the floor and screw it into the floor. And then we put cones out, and then you have to stand behind, and then everybody throws. And then you can't pull it out of the ground. You have to lift it up. And we do all this sort of stuff. And they throw about 6 times if they're lucky. There's 6 tape measures down. So they put the cone down and roughly guess what they do, and they walk back. And then year 11s turn up and they say, what are you doing? And you say, you were doing javelin. And so you're going to do almost exactly the same lesson. And I remember doing it. I remember having that lesson plan in my pocket and using it about 4 times in the same day. What I find really ironic about that is you see the javelin throwers walking around campus. They walk with them literally points in both directions, swinging them like like a bag. And funny enough, we've never had any fatalities. But I do think that, there's some interesting stuff there. But David said that we should have a shared philosophy, and I agree with that. But when you go to individual philosophies, there is a lot of sharing. So lots of people believe that the purpose of PE is, lifelong physical activity, and to prepare people for, what's seen top against it, and valuing the physically active life. But then when you dig into that, ask questions of people when we go through kind of curriculum reform and development. He said, so that's your purpose. Do the kids know that? Do the kids know that that's what you're trying to do? And also, does your curriculum reflect that aim? So if this is your non-negotiable, this is the thing that has to happen in your curriculum, where is it? Where is it not implicitly, but where is it overtly? Where is it that the young people know, and how is the curriculum structured to do this?
But can't you see there's an issue here? This dawned on me not so long ago. I don't know why it took me so long. But who seriously says that my main purpose is to prepare kids for lifelong physical activity? How would you ever know? How would you assess that? How would you be held accountable for that? And then England women win the European Championships. Do physical education teachers get credit for that? Of course they don't. No,
but they do get a responsibility to now teach football in every lesson.
Well, exactly. But my point is, seriously, folks, physical education teachers need to be accountable for stuff that happens during the curriculum time, because every other teacher is. And if you're going to defer your achievement to some intangible, future-oriented, can never be assessed and can never be attributed to you, except in those occasional cases where kids come back and tell you what a great time they had at school, and that's why they're now, a marathon runner or whatever, So I do think this is why models-based practice is so important. This is why pedagogical models are so important, which is what we're going to get onto, I think, soon.
Perfect segue. It's literally what I was going to ask now. So literally, I know you've both been advocates for models-based practice for a long time. So can you start to tell our audience what models-based practice is, and why you guys feel it should be embedded and used more within physical education?
Pedagogical models. The organising centre, and we steal this idea from a guy called Michael Metzler, the organising centre of the sports technique-based physical education programme is content. So if you go to the English National Curriculum, for example, you've got your aquatics, you've got your games, you've got gymnastics, content. What pedagogical models do is they say, and the difficulty is that physical education teachers go into a javelin lesson not just hitting learning objectives for throwing a javelin, but for health, for social skills, for a whole bunch of things that are supposed to happen through these particular lessons. What pedagogical models do is they say that, no, the organising centre needs to be pedagogy, and we define pedagogy as the interaction, interrelationship of curriculum, teaching, learning and assessment. Where learning is clearly defined, what do we want kids to learn? And we align curriculum, teaching and assessment in order to achieve particular learning outcomes or aspirations, depending on how specific you can be about the learning. So some well-known pedagogical models, we would say sport education, developed by Darrell Siedentop in the United States. Teaching games for understanding, developed by Dave Bunker and Rod Thorpe at Loughborough. There are new pedagogical models around, we think, an activist approach to working with adolescent girls, Kim Oliver's work, health-based physical education. There's developing models all the time, but they all have these key features that they take curriculum, teaching and assessment and they align them with learning aspirations or outcomes. And these become the organising centre of the curriculum. Just one word about the word pedagogical and why we favour that. The earliest that we're aware of in physical education approach to models-based practice is the work of Ann Jewett and Linda Bain in the States. Their 1985 book, The Curriculum Process in Physical Education, talked about curriculum models. Michael Metzler came along in the late 90s, also in the States, and he talked about instructional models. And some of those you would recognize the book, and some of those you would recognize, Ashley just held up for us. Some of those you would recognize more than the Jewett Bain stuff from the 80s. So you would see sport education in there, you would see games-based teaching in there. Why don't we go with curriculum instruction? Well, pedagogy incorporates both. It's a more holistic term, and we're very conscious of people, scholars, teachers who are not native speakers of English, coming along and seeing this proliferation of different words used to describe what effectively is the same thing. And we think, and we say this in our books, that pedagogical models, curriculum models, instructional models, and some people have even introduced teaching models, actually share more than they are different. They've got very, very similar features. They all take the four things together as the organizing center. So that's the pedagogical model. That's why we favor it. Probably a better term we think would be didactical models, because in Northern Europe, didactic is in France and Spain is the term that would be equivalent. But of course, didactics and didactical are terms that are seen pejoratively, mostly in the Anglophone world. So pedagogy is what we've got.
Thanks, David. And so, Ash, can you just build on David's comments around, these models and what they are and why they should be used more?
So one of the things that PE's taken responsibility for is having one main majority approach, which is a do after me approach, or a do as I say approach, or teacher led kind of approach, and it's trying to achieve lots of different things. So every time we teach, we might be teaching through. So if the organizing center of PE is cricket and football and netball and tennis, but we also want to teach some leadership, and we want to take kids to take some responsibility, and we want to do some health stuff. What we see is a predominant one way of teaching to try to achieve multiple aims. And what we're saying here, and from our research and looking at other people, is that we actually need to have horses for courses. So, from what outcomes you need to think about a different way of teaching and doing what it is that you do. And these pedagogical models are one way of doing that. So they have, different main ideas. So the main idea of sport education, as an example, is that you want to teach children to be competent, literate, enthusiastic sports persons, which basically means that the competence is a term. What is competence? Well, competence is not necessarily excellence. So no, in your own individual environment, it could be excellence, or actually you could be competent and very, very good. So, but what we want is kids to be able to have a go and to do something. So there's that kind of competence. The literacy is around, well, do I understand the game? Do I understand the activity? So could I pick it up and do it in the park? Could I go and watch it, at a local sports ground? Could I do it with my family? Could I do it with my friends? And do I have enough literacy to understand the kind of basic idea of what happens? And then that enthusiasm, actually, I want to do it. And enthusiasm and fun in PE are valuable outcomes. But I'm butting this because sometimes when we are active, it's not as fun as we think. So we go for a run, or we do something that's energetic. It actually tests us and challenges us, and in many respects can feel uncomfortable. But having the competence and the literacy to understand that, and the need to, okay, so I'm going to recover, and in, testing myself here, I'm going to see some benefits. We need to feel and understand that discomfort, but we need to have the enthusiasm to go back and do it again. And David's talked about that earlier, about, different levels of engagement that's coming through primary school. And by the time they get to 11, this is quite established. So how do we influence those? So we're looking at different outcomes. And when you look at a pedagogical model, then they've been theorized. So somebody has sat down and gone, okay, so this is not quite right. We've maybe identified a problem. They identified the problem with teaching games for understanding that, as I say, was developed at Loughborough, was that kids were spending a long time practicing individual skills, but had no idea of how to use them in a game. So you start with the underhand serve, and then you spend ages playing the overhead clear. But you only play the overhead clear to drive the person to the back of the court, to create space at the front of the court so that you can then exploit it. But what we often see in badminton is kids stood in the middle of the court hitting it backwards and forwards to each other, and they're playing not to lose. So they're not, and sometimes in a game you have to play not to lose because you're just recovering from what the other person's done. So they acknowledged that was a problem. So they said, well, what do we need to do? Well, we need to put kids into game-like situations and help them to understand the angles. So I teach it on the PGC. So we talk about space, force and time. So how do I play to space? How do I increase or decrease the force that I use? And how do I buy myself time? Well, the overhead clear is actually a buying time shot. It's not just a creating space at the front. It's also a buying time to recover from what's happened. But if you don't know why you're doing it, then it doesn't happen. So they had this theory, which they then started to put into preparation, and they developed a conceptual framework about what this would look like. And then they started to use it. There's a book in the library which was done by Dave Bunker, Rod Thorpe, and I believe Len Armand. It may have been Len that led on it, with teachers in commentary. So they're trying this, and they're doing little pieces of work. And I've got their original book, 1986 book, on my shelf. And the front of it is actually here it is. So this book, no, it's not. That's something else. It's about the same size as that. But the start of it is literally, it's a 4-page paper looking at what the model does. And then the other ones are examples from teachers who are using it. So that conceptual framework is then going into schools and being used, and it's coming into schools and out of schools. And there's a process where they've been co-designed, and, they've been challenged. And lots of models have had the same sort of things done that's informing the base. So we now got different models that achieve different things. But if we've got such a broad curriculum, then how do we start to put those together? And that's where models-based practice comes from.
Do you want to just come in on that, David?
To say something?
Yeah. I was just going to prompt you to the TGFU thing. Now, the important thing to say about TGFU and sport education, and this is Ash's phrase from the book, is that we've retrofitted those models to make them pedagogical models. Because when Bunker and Thorpe and Almond were developing TGFU, and Siedentop and his colleagues sport education, they weren't thinking about pedagogical models. They weren't thinking in those terms at all. So we've actually in the book gone back and we've recast these in the framework that we use. And pedagogical models would all have a main idea. What's this model about? So sport education, it's being able to play sport. They would have critical elements, the key things that must be there. So in case of sport education, it would be that there are persisting groups. That's teams that stay together for a whole sports season. There's a season. There's roles that the kids play in addition to players. So the timekeepers and warm-up officers and equipment officers, so on and so forth. Those are the critical elements. We can talk a wee bit about those because these have been misunderstood by quite a few people who claim that we're being prescriptive. And then the final thing is learning aspirations or outcomes. What do we want kids to learn? And in sport education, we want them to be enthusiastic, we want them to be competent, and we want them to be literate about particular sports and games. So pedagogical models have got that structure, and models-based practice is a curriculum that consists entirely of pedagogical models. What's happened in the past is that individual models like an activist approach to working with girls or TGFU have been parachuted into the multi-activity sports technique-based curriculum, often with tremendous challenges that represents. Martin, you mentioned the 4 to 6 week unit of badminton or basketball or whatever. Now, why do we do that? Well, we know that we have to rotate facilities. So if I'm on the playing field, Ash is in the gym and you're in the swimming pool, and then we rotate around those facilities, and these are expensive facilities, so we're not going to let them lie empty. Some pedagogical models can't work like that. So, for example, the activist approach to working with girls requires a phase called building the foundation, which takes girls into the classroom for 2 or 3 lessons where they do all sorts of stuff about their likes and dislikes and preferences and ways of working in physical education. The teacher collects information about them. They then do a sampling thing where they do different activity every week for 10 weeks. And then the second phase is a thematic phase where it could be learning how to exercise at home, at school, and in the sports centre. And so you can just see straight away the havoc that some of these models cause the multi-activity structure, which is one of the reasons why it's very, very difficult to get these things taken up completely. If you went to a models-based practice orientation, we think it would be easier because everybody's operating on a different logic to the traditional logic, which, by the way, is completely shaped and has remained shaped since the end of the 19th century by 2 coordinates. School organisation runs according to time and space, the timetable and the classroom. And these are massively, massively powerful forces that models-based practice has to confront.
That is really, really well kind of contextualized there in the challenges of implementing this, because I was thinking, when I did my PGCE, which was in 2005, or I finished it in 2005, teaching games for understanding was a big part of the things we were trying to learn. But then actually implementing that in practice when you went into schools wasn't really happening. So you were getting taught something on your PGCE and then you were potentially constrained a little bit by what's happening in the curriculum, and you've explained that really well. So my question from that is, how can teachers apply models-based practice in their teaching now?
Okay, so I used, when I did my PhD, my master's and my PhD, my PhD was an action research study looking at my own practice and how I moved my teaching from being a traditional to a models-based approach. And I managed to probably use 3 models in my curriculum, the way I taught. And I did that for a number of years. My PhD was actually 2 years worth of data gathering of me doing all of these things. And then it went on beyond that. And I worked within that multi-activity organising centre as being the 6-week blocks, 6 to 8 week blocks. But what I did is so for example, we did one situation where the students spent some time developing their own games. And the rule of these games, one of the foundational things, is they had to be playable on the ground and in water. Because I knew I was going into the swimming pool. So you have to be more creative in terms of how you think about the way that. So I would run, a block of work in the gym doing gymnastics, and then we transfer the same ideas, the same model into the swimming pool. So we do cooperative learning in both spaces. We do games making in 2 spaces. So actually, we have to move away from sometimes from the constraints of the facility that we have and the lines on the ground and whatever else is there, and start to think, well, how can I actually join these things together? But I think in the first instance, we just need to give it a go. Talk to people about what's the one thing you could change. And some of that's a relationship. So as a PGCE program lead till last year, and now the director of teacher education, it's our relationship with our schools to say, well, we're doing these things. These are the things we need to be proactive, helping them to understand the things that we do and why it's important. And I think that's been a piece that we haven't always got right. And some people are still resistant to that because they're working within their own context. And one of the things we talk about in pedagogical models and models-based practice is local agency. So we're saying that teachers should have the autonomy to do and understand what they're doing. So it's a bit of a balance. And David said when we were kind of not recording this that teachers have a really difficult job to do. We're not saying that, they're working within the constraints of space and time, as David just said. They're working within the constraints of tradition. They're working in the constraints of examination PE. They're working with heavy workloads and over assessing and over monitoring and over reporting. So teachers still do very good jobs. They're still very, many of them, vast majority of them, are student-centered, and they're trying to do the best that they can, but they're in constraining processes. So, some of the work that we need to do is to sort of try to free them up and to help politicians and people to understand that this is not the right way to do whatever physical education is. This is not the right way to do it. But what we're saying once we've done that is, if we're talking about a models-based curriculum, so what do you want the kids to know? And therefore, how do you create a curriculum that reflects different models? So I was talking to somebody on a CPD event it was recorded, but it was online, but it was with the Scottish PE teachers. Somebody said to me, I've heard of the activist approach. What is it? How do I use it? Well, I'm saying, instead of having a curriculum choice where you just say, right, you can choose the activity that you want to do, but it's one of 5 because they're the only things that we can do, and they're constrained by space and time and all those things. The activist approach is a decision to say, right, well, let's educate girls, because it's been sort of focused around the disengagement of teenage girls and how that's happening. But let's spend some time and let's talk to them, let's educate them, help them understand the constraints, but help them understand what they want to do, and get them to design a curriculum, and then enact that curriculum with their support and their understanding and broader knowledge. But this might take you a year, so that you're actually thinking that instead of just offering a broader curriculum, we're investing more in terms of helping these young women to begin to value the work that they're doing in PE and see a purpose in it and understand some of the constraints actually that operate within school in terms of space and time. And that's a big investment for someone to say, well, we can offer choice in a limited way, or we can actually offer choice and co-construction. And that's a very different piece of work. And when you're in a position where you've got lots of time constraints and a lot of external drivers, it's not an easy thing to do all the time. But there are examples of models-based practice that, where schools are beginning to do this. So I've been doing some work with a school in England, and they're now in their 3rd year of enacting a models-based curriculum, and they now have it through year 7, 8 and 9. One of my PhD students has been talking to students, Sam Faulkner, has been talking to teachers who purport to be using models-based practice and looking at how they're doing it in different contexts and what it looks like. So, he's writing his thesis up at the moment, but some of that work coming out of that is very interesting in terms of what needs to happen. So people are, finding models, people are enacting models, people are using models-based practice as a multi-model curriculum. I mean, a models-based practice is multi-models. There was a really nice piece in PE Matters recently by an undergraduate student who'd done some work in this. And it was a really nice piece, although I think fundamentally she said it's either using a single model or it's using multiple models. And David and I would argue, and then she cited David and I. Well, David and I would argue that it is only the use of multiple models. But this is where the confusion occurs, because if you read Mike Metzler's work, which is models-based instruction, and lots of the work in the field around single models, they use the term models-based practice. So this is the confusion that we have, is that we don't have a clear definition of what it is, but we're talking about a multi-model approach. So choosing the things that you want to do, you're choosing the models that best allow you to do those things, and then you're enacting those models or adopting those models in a curriculum.
Just to backtrack a wee bit on what Ash was saying about teachers taking this up, and back to your question about how can teachers do this. One of my doctoral students, Cara Lamb, who's also a colleague at Strathclyde, runs our PGDE course, has just finished her PhD. And it was a 2-year study that looked at teachers in their own school environment being supported to learn to use an activist approach with girls. And it was the parachute thing. The activist approach was dropped into a multi-activity curriculum. So they had to be kind of semi-schizophrenic, 1 minute they were thinking in skill terms and fitness terms and short units of work. And then the next thing they're working with Oliver's activist approach. A wee read at that thesis just really shows you the challenges of doing this work. So we do not for 1 second say that this is easy. But also we don't say it's impossible. It is possible, and we've got evidence that it's possible, and we've got evidence about what needs to happen to support teachers. The last thing what teachers need to do is what Ash did, do it by yourself, or do it by yourself with someone like me to talk to as your PhD supervisor. Not recommended. What you need to do is, the first thing you need to do is recruit others to work with you. And if you can't crack that one, and then if you can't crack persuading school management that this is a really good idea, so we need evidence. You need to start, the small ways you can start is start to try different things and start to record in some way or other some evidence of the effect you're having. And it needn't be difficult, extremely difficult. I very well remember when I worked in Queensland in Australia, they had a senior high school examinable curriculum. And one of the methods of assessment was the teacher, at that time, we had video cameras that sat on your shoulder, they were massive big things. A teacher jogging up to this kid who's doing bounding exercises. And the teacher says to him, "G'day, mate," the usual Australian thing. And then he says, "What are you doing?" And the kid says, "I'm doing plyometrics, sir." And what's plyometrics? And the kid goes into this really good explanation of sliding filament theory and why it's important for triple jumping, etc., etc., etc. That's not difficult to do if that's part of what it is. And they were very interested in the integration of theory and practice. Wonderful example of an assessment technique. So building that evidence of what works, what can be achieved, what is possible, is part of what I think teachers who are interested in changing their practice need to do, and then using that to persuade the key stakeholders that this is a good idea. The other bit of this, by the way, is that kids in secondary schools are already, we've mentioned this, already well socialised into particular pedagogical forms in physical education. They've got expectations about what's going to happen in a lesson. So you need to work with them as well. It won't just happen. If you want to co-construct physical education with your kids, just chatting to them about what their preferences and likes are is a good start. But don't just imagine that that's you done and dusted. So there's another challenge for teachers, is to work with their kids.
I've been scribbling little notes down here, and I'm just aware and conscious of time, and we're probably starting to draw to a close on this. And some of my notes, so collaboration being a key word that I put down there, and that there's multiple avenues of this collaboration. So that's potentially researchers, but practitioners in terms of the PE teacher, it's collaboration with the students. You also mentioned senior management, and to me, and Ash, some of the words you said I'd written down, and then you started to say them. So around the values. And some of it comes back to, right at the start, we talked about what's the purpose of PE. And potentially for me, some of this comes back to building that together around that purpose, co-creating that purpose and the kind of values that are driven by the school and the pupils and the practitioner, to then start to embed and implement the relevant models in the relevant spaces. Now, that is very, very complex. But as you just said, it can start small, and it can start with an individual such as Ash, actually making these changes and developing, potentially getting advocates for the work, whether that be a researcher or whether that be a coalition of like-minded people in your PE department, can help to kind of facilitate that change. I hope that's summarised some of the stuff you said there. So let's take the next step and say, okay, what's next for both models-based practice and you guys as individuals, or maybe even together? So David, what do you think?
I think that this work that Ash is leading with teachers in schools is really, really important. I think studies like Cara's, where she's gone and looked at how teachers learn in situ in their own school context, is really important. We need to gather more and more evidence with a very focused programme of work that's looking at use of multiple models in physical education. By the way, this is not a challenge that physical educators alone face. I have a PhD student at the moment who's a design and technology person, a principal teacher in a school in Scotland, where the school has gone to problem-based learning, interdisciplinary learning for 3 days a week. facing exactly the same issues as we were talking about with models-based practice. Very, very interesting, the parallels running there. So this is an issue to do with schools as organisations as much as anything. So I think there's work needs going at multiple levels, gathering the empirical evidence, working innovatively with teachers, building relationships, supporting teachers as best we can, but also beginning to challenge in an informed way the school structures that make schools less flexible to allow innovation to happen. I think there's an appetite, in the education sector for new ways of working. I think this problem-based learning thing, for example, is a good example of that. And we said off Mike earlier, a lot of teachers are working together, working with academics. We need to make that kind of online stuff that's happening, those online communities, those online hubs, more visible and maybe more vocal. So I would encourage that, to find outlets for this sort of work. This podcast, No,
definitely coming together and developing finding your tribe and developing together and growing, I think, is a great thing for anybody in any realm. Ash, do you want to add to that in terms of what do you think of the future?
Yeah, I mean, change for me became about identifying that what I was doing was not what I wanted to do, and I wanted to find a different way of doing it. And it took a while to get there. So it's acknowledging that this is a long-term plan. I learned to teach from my teachers predominantly. And by the time I got to my teacher education, I didn't really have, I don't think, that much give in terms of the way that I wanted to teach. I wanted to teach in a particular way. And it wasn't until, I met a colleague of mine, a friend of mine called Graham Moore, who was working in a sports college in the northwest of England, and he had this idea of honesty, awareness, and responsibility. And if we all did that, we could all live in harmony. So HAR, we all live in harmony. And I was like, what is this? What's going on here? But actually realised that it was just different to what I was doing, and actually became more in line with the things I wanted to do. And then, I was ready then to kind of make the change. And then I discovered models. And then it was about collecting the evidence. Now, I was doing a master's and then a PhD, so I was collecting empirical evidence anyway, but it was on my own practice. But I started writing a reflective diary at that point, and I did it for about 500 odd days during my PhD. And then when I moved to higher education, a colleague of mine said, well, what are you going to do? You're now moving into a really traditional environment. What are you going to do? So I started writing that diary on the 5th of September 2009, and I haven't missed a day since. And that's a form of short reflection of what I'm doing in terms of my practice. But change is evidence-based. Teachers, they all the time, show me evidence. Where's this worked? Who's done this? Where have they done this? And it works at, in the classroom, and it works at senior management, and it works in multi-academy trusts. They need evidence. So David's talked about gathering that evidence to show what works. We've talked in models literature about blueprints, and David and I talked about non-negotiables, and we've moved away from that because there is no such thing as the perfect model. You can't do sport education. It doesn't exist as a thing. You can't pick it up, as David says, and put it into a school. You have to meld it and you have to work with it. So when we've been talking about modeling, we're not talking about a model. We're talking about somebody working with clay and fitting it and molding it to the situation in which they're with. And moving away from that idea that there is a perfect version of sport education is really important. The aspiration to do something differently and to develop that knowledge and develop it over time and develop what I termed pedagogical fluency, which is, I was talking to a colleague of mine who was a French national working in the school I was working in, and her English was, flawless. And I said, well, when did you find out you were fluent in English? She said, when I started to think in English. And that really struck me as an idea of, well, how do I become pedagogically fluent? Well, it's when I start to think. So the decisions I'm making, I'm not translating it through my old approach. I'm actually able to make those decisions, and it takes time. But we need to work in a situation there aren't enough academics in models-based practice to work with every teacher who wants to use models-based practice. So we have to start to move away from that need for collaboration at that individual level to as David says, a wider collaboration where people are actually able to engage in communities and understand the literature, but in a usable way. And that takes time and resource to do. I mean, on the 31st January, I'm running a sandpit event at Loughborough on models-based practice, and I've invited anyone who wants to come for the day with little structure, is the idea, to talk about models. And I have 40 places, which, we're going to, find a room and feed them and do it at the Elite Athlete Hotel. But that's an opportunity to begin to get that sense. And currently, I think I've got 38 of those 40 places filled. Some of them are academics, but lots of them are teachers. And the idea is, well, what do you want to know? So it's not going to be a workshop. I'm not going to do anything on this is a model and this is what you want to do. What I want to do is start to create exactly what David's talking about, which is beginning to get a hub around how do people talk and learn from each other. Now, that's going to require me to do some more work afterwards to keep that together and to try to bring them together again and again and bring other people into that. But that's really important. And this is what the teachers in Sam's study are saying, is that we've got to a level of expertise, but what do we do now? How can we now develop that next level? And this is where this collaboration is. And how do we support teachers to do that? And they've all had to get permission, as you would expect, to get out of school. One school is two people wanted to come, but the school's only managed to give them, because they're a small department, only one place. So only one person. So now how do I help that teacher to disseminate to the rest of the department? And it's those things that become more interesting to me and more challenging in terms of how we begin to do that. How do anyone who asks me to come and do something on models, like I did on, I want to do it because that's part of my professional responsibility to try to, spend some time. I can't do everything. I won't get inundated now, but I try to at least be able to give up an hour to talk to people about what models are. I think we need to be mindful of what PE. I was trying to find this and I can't find it, but John Evans wrote once something along the lines of PE has no more responsibility for making kids healthy as mathematicians have responsibility of making pupils millionaires. I really like that idea, is that getting that understanding and knowing is what we're about, but we can't take on the challenge of health. It's a much wider intersectional wicked problem that we need to deal with. So coming back to the arguments, we need to think about what PE is, what it is in our schools, what it is the things, and then create curricula that allow us to do that. And I very deliberately write about models-based practice being our future of PE, because there are other ways of going, but I do think we need to have a conscious decision of what that way is and give ourselves time. So we see with, change of government, actually having, everything's broken, so we need to do something different. Well, change takes time and we need to invest in it. So if we keep changing, then, it doesn't always lead to the changes, the results that we want, I guess.
I think regards there, I think, like I said, I think we're pretty much run out of time. And we've kind of recapped a little bit, but in terms of recapping on that future piece, it's been really good to hear about what models-based practice is and the variety of models available, how this could be implemented. I think some of the key things you touched upon there are, change does take time, but you've got a cohort of people who are now coming together at a meeting you're hosting soon. And it's that power of people and the aspiration to develop and move things forward. It seems very much that like a lot of PE has been done in a traditional sense just because this is the way we do PE. And you're challenging that concept to kind of actually, no, we can change this, we can move this forward, we can make it better. But I've said we 3 or 4 times. It's not the academic doing some research and saying you need to do this. It's we need to come together with the knowledge of pupils, teachers, researchers, senior management to actually move this dial forward and take the next steps. I think it's going to be really interesting over the next, realistically, 5, 10, 15 years to see where this goes and how it develops. And I'm sure we could talk about many other things on a podcast, but it'd be great to see in 5 years' time of where we can have more and more of these case studies of where this has moved forward and where that dial's gone in this space. So I'd love to thank you for coming on the podcast. And hopefully we can get together again and talk more about other avenues around physical education.
Thanks very much, Martin.
Really good.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@alborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.